My name is Ethan Harkness, and I'm an associate professor at the Gallatin School at New York University. And it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker in our Emerging Scholars presentation series. This series is organized and hosted by NYU's Center for Ancient Studies, and I would like to thank Matthew Santarocco and Maura Pollard for their support of the series. The Emerging Scholars series showcases the research of current PhD candidates, and we are particularly excited to engage approaches to the study of the ancient world that incorporate non-traditional materials and/or methods. Today's speaker is Yanxiao He. Yanxiao is a doctoral student at the University of Chicago's Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. He's almost finished with that program, expecting to graduate in June of 22. Yanxiao is already the author of a number of both published and forthcoming papers. And today he's going to talk to us about his forthcoming paper entitled Sophitos, the Western Sea People and Popular Performers on the Indian Ocean. And recently we've received the good news that this essay is the winning essay of the 2021 Eric S. Gruen Prize. So congratulations for that, Yanxiao. That's very exciting. So I will now turn it over to Yanxiao He.
Thanks for Professor Harkness' very generous introduction, and also thanks for Center for Asian Studies at NYU for incorporating my project into the Emerging Scholars series. Broadly, my research concerns about the interaction between the Greco-Roman world and the Eastern worlds, especially Iran, Central Asia, and China. My dissertation project tackles how the increased connection among Iranian Parthian Empire, Central Asia, and China from late 2nd century BCE onward impacted ethnographic productions in both the Mediterranean and China. And the paper I will be presenting today, Sophitos, Western Sea People and Popular Performers on the Indian Ocean, is part of my dissertation project. And the main argument of this paper is the Mediterranean performers transmitted the knowledge about Rome to China through their embodied performance. It's not a secret that Mediterranean performers have appeared in China during 2nd century CE, or more precisely 120 CE. Our very famous account in Chinese official history, Hou Han Shu, there's an episode that in the year of 120 CE, a group of performers from Mediterranean arrived in China, and they called themselves as the Western Sea People, 海西人. Although it's very well known, but it has not been dealt with properly in any depth way. So in conjunction with other classical material, I'm going to give a global background about how it come about. And the other major material in my paper is the Sophitos inscription, which is from today's Kandahar in southern Afghanistan. This inscription has been excavated around 2003 or 4. And because it's written in ancient Greek and in very educated Homeric idiom, and as the most complete literary production, Greek literary production from Central Asia, so it has excited many scholars. So I'm going to give a new interpretation of this inscription by regarding Sophitos as a wandering performer who make his fortune in the Mediterranean. Although the main time period from the Mediterranean perspective in my paper is Imperial Rome, especially the first 2 centuries after our era, but my paper starts from late 2nd century BCE, the Hellenistic period. And although my main focus is more on the Far East, on China, but my paper starts from the Far West, from the Sicily. In 130s BCE, there's a slave revolt in Sicily. And many of those rebellious slaves are from Syria, especially its leader, Yunus. And our source make it highlight that the rebellion leader, Yunus, is very good at magician and he can pull out fire. And based on this description, I argue that Yunus was originally exported from Syria to Sicily as a performer. Based on his performative talent, he gained his cultural capital among his fellow slaves. So when those slaves could not bear with the Roman domination, they decided to rebel. They elected Yunus as their leader. And it's very interesting that 1 decade later, in the 120s BCE, Chinese envoy Zhang Qian, we move from Far West to Far East. Chinese envoy to Central Asia, Zhang Qian, returned from Central Asia to China and presented the knowledge about the outside world to the Chinese emperor. And he presented the region from Syria to India. Sima Qian preserved this knowledge in his work, Shi Ji. So when it comes to Syria, it's mentioned that the Syrian people are very, very good at magician. I find it's fantastic. 1 decade before, and Syrian slaves rebelled and the magicians were involved. That draw attention from Roman elite, from Roman official. But 1 decade later, Chinese official become aware that Syrian people are very good at magician. So my argument is that Syria exported performer to both the West, Sicily, Italy, and to further east simultaneously during the late 2nd century BCE. Although I don't have direct evidence for Syrian exportation of performers to the east, but I have several indirect evidence. One major evidence is also from Sima Qian's Shi Ji. During the 110th BCE, the Iranian Parthian dynasty sent envoys to China. Together with envoys, there were performers from Li Xuan. And based on phonological reconstruction, Li Xuan referred to Alexandria in Egypt, which means that Parthia got some performers from Alexandria. We also have evidence about in the early 1st century BCE, and Egypt exported performers to India through the Indian Ocean. So we can paint the picture about how Parthian court got some performers from Alexandria through this dynamic slave trade in which performers were part of object exported on the Indian Ocean. Although it's about Alexandria, but not about Syria. But for Syria, we have very good evidence. In Sima Qian's description of Syria, it's mentioned about Parthian intermediary role in informing Chinese knowledge about Syria. As I mentioned, China was aware that Syrian people are good at magician. That can be transmitted through Parthian. So we have some indirect evidence about Syria also exported performer to Parthia, and then China become aware about that. So from late 2nd century BCE, based on this hint, we already can have a general picture about global network of Eastern Mediterranean performer, Alexandria and Syria. They are both become a major center of pop performance during Roman Empire. And in late 2nd century BCE, Alexandria and Syria were part of Ptolemaic and Seleucid empires, two major successor states of Alexandria. But during the 1st century BCE, both regions, Syria and Egypt, were incorporated into the Roman Empire. So then it comes to my main temporary focus, from late 1st century BCE in the Augustan age. And under the Augustan age, pop performance, especially pantomime, has grown spectacularly in the Roman Empire. And under Augustus' patronage, there's a kind of milestone event that in 20th BCE, two performers, one from Alexandria, one from Sicilia in today's southeastern Turkey, came to Rome, and they got support from Augustus. And pantomime gradually become a very kind of empire-wide sensation in Roman Empire. So my argument, when it comes to Sophitos inscription, which is dated to late 1st century BCE or early 1st century CE, my argument is Sophitos, someone in today's Kandahar in Central Asia, got knowledge about the growth of pop culture, pop performance in Rome. Then he decided to make fortune by traveling from Central Asia and to the Mediterranean, very likely via the Indian Ocean. Although we don't have direct evidence, that's very difficult to do for Asian pop culture study, but we also have several hints that we can make an argument. First, from the internal evidence from the Sophitos inscription. First of all, we have a story very similar to the Sophitos inscription. That's from a Buddhist text from 3rd century CE, from Taxila in today's Pakistan. That text has a Sanskrit original, has got lost, but it's preserved in Chinese translation. So basically the story is there's an Indian and who has a distinguished family, but it's declined. Then his snobbish relatives looked down upon him, so he decided to travel to the Mediterranean. And the Chinese text mentions Daqing, the Great Qing, the standard Chinese term for Mediterranean of Roman Empire. Then he made fortune in the Mediterranean. He returned to home and his snobbish relatives and begin to think highly of him. It's basically the very similar outline for Sophitos inscription. But Sophitos, although Sophitos' career is mercantile, but more particularly, he is a performer. I have two internal hints from the inscription. One is at the beginning, Sophitos mentioned that after his family has declined and he mastered the arts of music, that may help him to revive his house in the future. So the mastery of arts of music can refer to the kind of mastery of artistic skill, including performance, dance. Although it can also talk about the mastery of Greek language, then he can do merchant, he can do trade. But one thing can disprove that Sophitos is an ordinary merchant, because in subsequent line, and it mentioned that Sophitos travel from cities to city. That's actually go against the pattern for long-distance trade on the Indian Ocean. We have good documentary evidence, like for merchants who brought Eastern luxury, like from India or from China to the Mediterranean. They just stop at some major port like Alexandria, but there are some other Mediterranean merchants who then responsible to distribute those luxury in the Mediterranean. So there are much more knowledgeable people to distribute the Eastern goods from the East and to further in the Mediterranean market. So for those non-distance trade merchants, they only had to bring those items to like Alexandria. They didn't have to go further. So Sovietors didn't have to travel from Mediterranean, one city to another city. It doesn't make any sense, but it makes much more sense. He is a performer, so he has to make his living, make his fortune by performing from this city to the next city, so he can accumulate wealth. So in conjunction with the reference, he's mastery the arts of music. So best scenario is that he's a performer. In addition to that, we also have other account that during Augustus' time in 20th BCE, there's some Indian envoy who reached out to Augustus when the emperor is in Antioch in Syria. And there's Indian performer in together with the envoy. So Strabo, the Greek geography, recount this episode. He also highlights that some very poor Indian and they come to make fortune by their performance. It's also excellent evidence. It can happen that someone as far as India can come to Mediterranean to make fortune based on their performance. And it's also the time when pop performance got supported by Augustus. Then so Sophocles can fit this pattern. But the next question is how the information about the growth of pop culture in Mediterranean can be transmitted to Sophocles who live in Central Asia, far away from the Mediterranean. I have several hints. The most important one is a speech by Dio Chrysostom, a Greek orator intellectual in the second half of first century CE and also early second century CE. In one of his speeches delivered to the people of Alexandria, he basically condemned for Alexandria's addiction to pop performance. He mentioned, you Alexandria do nothing but watch performance. And he mentioned that I can see in the theater, there are the people all around the world. He mentioned Bactrian, Indian, Persian, and Scythian, those Far Eastern people. And he mentioned these people can have experience with watching performance with you. And after they return to their home regions, they just mentioned that those Alexandria are not serious people. They just watch pantomime performance all days. We should be aware that Dao is an elite orator, so he has a bias toward pop culture. I think a more likely scenario is that those people, Bactrian Indian, have a very good experience in watching pantomime performance in Alexandrian theater. Then they share their good experience in Alexandria after returning to home. And Dao also particularly highlight that Alexandria has been well connected to the Indian Ocean, so its image can spread around very easily. So regardless of Dao's elite bias, a more kind of history we can get out of is pop performance is a vehicle to shape the image of Alexandria and can spread around to the further east through Indian Ocean. So it's possible for Sophocles, even he from the other side of the Indian Ocean, but Indian Ocean was very, very dynamic as both Indian people and the Mediterranean people have mastered the pattern of monsoon. They can travel very easily back and forth within 1 year or 2 years. So this is the second section of my paper about the world of Sophocles under the context of the growth of pop culture in the Mediterranean. And when it comes to my third section about the arrival of Mediterranean performer in China. So it's not a coincidence. It's a further expansion of the Mediterranean performance network from like Iran to Central Asia, Indian, and eventually to China. It's not a coincidence. There's global history behind it. And my takeaway is this performance at least partially responsible for kind of transmitting Chinese for knowledge about Rome from the Mediterranean to China. And in Hou Han Shu, we have a lengthy account of Rome, which is called the Great Chain, and a very utopian image. And so how do we account for the knowledge formation? My argument is those performances were partially responsible for shaping this knowledge. We have some other supporting evidence. During 50 CE, and Roman knowledge has already been transmitted to today's Sri Lanka through Indian Ocean. So it's already kind of the knowledge about Rome already circulated around the Indian Ocean. So for what we can see from the performers' arrival in China, they can bring that knowledge further east to China because they travel from Mediterranean through Indian Ocean and maybe to India, then through the Bay of Bengal, then to today's Burma. And because they come to China together with the Burmese envoy. And also from Chinese side, we have two other major episodes for Sino-Roman connection. The most famous one is later in 160 CE. Some Roman merchant pretended to be Roman envoy arrived in China through today's Vietnam. And they presented tributes. And Hou Han Shu make it very clear that the Chinese officials were very disappointed when seeing those tributes. And they don't think Rome is as kind of utopian as they imagined. And the Chinese account that mentioned that the people who transmitted the image of Rome made the exaggeration. So we can infer that by the time when those Roman merchants arrived in China in 160 CE, Chinese officials already come up with a certain image of Rome. So those performers can be responsible for shaping that image. Prior to their arrival in 90 CE, China tried to reach out to Rome by sending Gan Yin to Rome, a very famous episode. Gan Yin stopped in the Persian Gulf. He didn't move further west. But Gan Yin can access some knowledge about Rome through Indian Ocean network. But we can perfectly construe that when China already have a basic sense of Rome, when some Mediterranean performers come to China, Chinese officials could be very excited to further inquire about how the Roman Empire looked like, what their home region looked like. Then China further accumulate knowledge about Rome. And so finally, those performers also perform at the imperial banquet in 121 CE. And then there's the court debate. Some people think, some officials think the barbarian foreign performance shouldn't be displayed at the Chinese court. But on the other side, many people, including Chinese Emperor An, were fascinated by the performance. Then the other side also cited the Confucian canon that pop performance should have a place in imperial culture. Although it involves certain kind of Confucian debate on how to properly situate pop culture, but if we look globally, we can also further interpret its cultural implication, because in 160 CE, a Syrian author called Lucian, who wrote in Greek, wrote a treatise called the Stratagem on Dance. And at the beginning, and also one side mentioned he went to watch a pantomime performance in Antioch yesterday, and his interlocutor accused of him, "You are so well educated, how could you go to watch pop performance and you will be communicated from the scholars company? You read Homer, you read Plato, but you watch pop performance, you are not one of us again." Then the people that one justifies the kind of virtue of pop performance, and pop performance is also very serious cultural activity. So if we look at Lucian's dialogue and the Chinese court debate together, we can find how the two civilizations, Greco-Roman civilization, Chinese civilization, responded to pop performance by using their own classics to kind of justify whether pop culture is bad or good. Simultaneously, that's a truly global moment when we talk about global classics, which is also the agenda of Center for Asian Study. And this is basically my general kind of outline of my paper. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Yanxiao. That was brilliant and fascinating. It's such interesting work you're doing. I have a number of questions I'd like to raise, but maybe I'll start with a sort of a background question or underlying question about your motivation and your sense of the potential of this approach to your work, particularly centering popular culture. It seems like a rich vein to tap, and you've already found so much to say about these large global networks of cultural communication, but I'd love to know a little bit more about what you think the potential of this methodology is.
Yeah, for methodology, I think the major, if there is a contribution, I further highlight the pop culture as a very significant cultural element in antiquity, especially from East Asian perspective. If we ask general educated Chinese, maybe Japanese or Korean, what's their perception of Greco-Roman civilization? They will think it's very elite, it's a philosophy, it's law, it's tragedy. But actually, what I kind of the history I dig out is that the kind of the genre of Greco-Roman civilization East Asia encounter for the first time is not elite culture, but pop culture. Pop culture has been instrumental in cultural exchange in antiquity. And this is more for the Asian history side. And broadly, I also have some ambition to have some dialogue with contemporary pop culture studies, especially a very dynamic research on K-pop in conjunction with the growth of K-pop around the globe, especially in the US. One book particularly informed about this paper is a book called Pop City. So it basically deals with how K-pop shaped the global image of South Korea. And maybe before that, people are more familiar with China, Japan for East Asia, and South Korea is maybe not so well known. But after K-pop arrived and South Korea become a kind of fantastic place for many people. So this book really inspired me also to think about how pop performers shape the image of Mediterranean, especially in China. So when I encounter like Dao's speech, like you should be careful about your image, and not all people from other regions also watch pantomime in your theater. It's a perfect illustration about how pop culture can shape the people's perception of certain region. Yeah, so I also have a certain kind of ambition to have dialogue with the contemporary pop culture studies.
It's really fascinating to just see these such long-term trends of such long duration, and the continuities between ultra modern and the really ancient past. If I could follow up with a more particular question about the at that time popular culture art of pantomime in particular, I'd love to hear if you could flesh out a little bit our sense of what pantomime is actually. I think a modern listener might envision a kind of a French clown running into an invisible wall, but there seems to be more to it here. There's almost a connection with magic. There's you'll almost simultaneously refer to these people who use fire or dismember themselves, and the silence of the art is a fascinating aspect of it as well. So is there anything more you could tell us about what pantomime is?
Yeah, sure. And in the Asian Mediterranean, I think there are two distinguished features of pantomime as a performative genre compared with the more well-known like tragedy and comedy. And one thing nature is, as we assume pantomime is silent dance. So pantomime is the English word originated from ancient Greek pantomimos, which means imitating everything, which means that the pantomime dancer don't speak, they just use their dancing body to kind of produce the story outline, and by performing very, very complicated, very demanding bodily gestures. So that's one distinguished feature. The other distinguished feature is compared with the tragedy and comedy, which were part of, especially in ancient Greece, part of Greek civic culture, and each city-state at the official festival. So, and they sponsor the tragedy and the comedy performance. So it's more kind of civic in nature, but pantomime is much more mercantile. It's not limited to certain cities, certain region, but they travel around, make fortune. And we have, before the Roman Empire, we have two kind of episodes for pantomime, testimony for pantomime. One is very early in 4th century BCE, and in a classical Athenian author, Xenophon, he has kind of work, symposium about Socrates, the philosopher Socrates had a banquet with his friends. Then they held some performers from Sicily, and they perform, and Socrates has a philosophical reflection on their performance. So this is the earliest testimony. And the other major testimony, especially the word pantomimos, is from an inscription from today's Western Asia Minor in 80s BCE. So someone hired a pantomime performer to perform from other region, but it's only really become like I mentioned, a sensation in Roman Empire under Augustus' patronage. Then Alexandria, Antioch become two major centers of performance. I think one major reason is pantomime has do with the silent performance nature of pantomimes. And the Roman Empire is as diverse as kind of ethnic, both ethnically and linguistically as diverse as the United States. Many people don't speak Greek, many people don't speak Latin, but the silent dance can be comprehensible to everyone. That's the reason that a 1st century CE Roman grammarian Quintilian, he mentioned that pantomime is really the universal, default universal language that everyone can come get out of something based on their own comprehension. Yeah, I think so. Two features, silent and mercantile.
It's fascinating. Yeah, this well, both features really, but that the silent nature of it being so perfectly suited to transmission throughout the far-flung Roman Empire and reception by such diverse audiences. It also leads me to my next question about the reception of the pantomime performances, and you raise the amazing example of performers ultimately from Alexandria getting all the way to the Eastern Han court and performing for the emperor there in New Year's ceremonies. But it makes me wonder about the essentially the meaning of the performance in such a different context of reception. So you mentioned the mercantile nature of it in Alexandria, and essentially they're selling tickets to their performances and moving from city to city, putting themselves in front of as much audience as possible. But in the Chinese case, it seems like something completely different. Performing for the emperor in this this aristocratic setting, the nature of the patronage is different. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good question. That's especially for Eastern Han Dynasty. We have a lot of visual evidence for performer, especially from Sichuan in southwestern China and Shandong in eastern China. We have those pop performance, depiction, pop performer. Although we also have several monographs from Chinese scholars, a very amazing kind of detailed account. But one thing I'm not very particularly comfortable is people usually say like, oh, that depiction, that performance doesn't look like standard Chinese, they must be foreign. Although I believe there are foreign performers in China, maybe a lot of, from basic art historical methodological perspective, it doesn't make too much sense to read ethnicity into visual evidence, unless there's some inscription together mention where they come from, but unfortunately, that's not from Chinese visual art. And as you mentioned, Professor Harkness is a very kind of aristocratic patronage. Although in Mediterranean, it's more really pop culture and mass entertainment, and in the city like Alexandria and Antioch, very massive theater construction, very capacious. But in China, we don't have that kind of comparative thing in Han China. So it's more private. It's more in the house, in the banquet, more aristocratic. So it assumes a different nature. But I think that has to do with the different monumentality in Mediterranean and China. And it's basic common sense for art historian like early China monumentality lakes, public spectatorship lakes, too much public function like their counterpart in the Mediterranean context. So that's a major difference, especially for Eastern Han. But for Western Han, I think there's maybe some more interesting thing. As I mentioned, in 110 BCE, there are performers from Alexandria come to China with Persian envoy, and Sima Qian also go follow up that then China begin to realize to develop its own pop culture to entertain foreigners. At that time, especially after China connected with Central Asia, a lot of foreign people come to China. So I think China also was very aware about the kind of global audience, use pop culture to shape its global image. So using today's term, so China also want to improve its soft power in front of global audience. That's Western Han, but Eastern Han, maybe I think it's true that it's more aristocratic, it's more private in nature. Yeah.
Thank you. It's just so fascinating to think about. Time is getting a little short, so I want to maybe come full circle and come back to one more methodology type question that I had. But this one's more text-based. I noticed you refer to a couple of texts to show transmission of popular culture and arts, both in the Eastern and Western direction. So there's the Acts of Thomas, which talks about Christian proselytizing in India, but then getting there and finding, I think it was a Hebrew flute girl or something. So evidence coming from that direction, and then the wonderfully named Buddhist garland of examples talking about transmission in the other direction. And my question about these texts is that they're clearly centered in their respective religious traditions with their own purposes within those traditions, and you're using them to do history. And I'm wondering about the methodological issues involved with that.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good question. In late antique and medieval studies, there is established a method to use religious text, especially Christian hagiography, to do history, not only for history of Christianity, but how to use those hagiographic texts to do secular social and cultural history. I think the notion of social imaginary provide a very useful analytic tool to think about how to effectively use these kind of problematic sources. So like the mention of the appearance of flute girl, Hebrew flute girl at Indo-Parthian court So although we cannot use it as direct evidence, there must be such thing happen. But what it can indicate is what people take granted in their culture and cognitive framework that they can think about. So when they something they take it granted, it means that it's already a pattern that consciously or unconsciously that they write down, and that's also for that Buddhist fable. So the agenda is Buddha make this fable, meaning that people devoted to Buddhism not only for their religious purpose, but they want to make money to get good wishes, to get good reward. Then Buddha make that fable that someone make fortune to Mediterranean, and his snobbish relatives then look highly of them in contrast with their previously negative attitude. Although we cannot argue that there's such a person, he make fortune as a real history, but we can argue that people already take it for granted that it's possible that people make fortune through long distance trade by traveling as far as the Mediterranean. So it means social imaginary, it's within their cognitive framework. It's not kind of absurd thing, so they think it can be possible. When they think it can be possible, it means that there's already such a pattern behind it. So even though we cannot take it at face value, but we can kind of detect some cultural logic underneath this kind of religious text.
Thank you. Yes, I couldn't agree more. I think this concept of the social imaginary is really valuable for doing the kind of work, any kind of work in ancient studies, really, where evidence is often so hard to come by, and finding these other angles to construct arguments and approach problems is extremely helpful. I guess lastly, I would just like to ask you about any notion of a follow-up project you might have. Where do you see yourself going with this kind of work?
Yeah, thanks. That's another very good question. I have indeed thought about my follow-up project after my dissertation. There are two projects in my mind, but one that's directly related to this chapter about pop culture is about the pop performance in Syria and its relationship with the Roman imperialism. And in this chapter, I tackle about the transmission of Eastern Mediterranean pop culture to India, to Iran, to China. But I want to look back to original context, especially in Syria, the city of Antioch is the major center of pop culture. We not only have a literary testimony, like I mentioned, Lucia, we have other literary testimonies. Actually, we also have visual evidence, especially the mosaic that have depiction of the performance. And what's most amazing is that in 3rd century CE, and there's a Syrian priest called Elagabalus, and he has active interaction with Roman soldier. A lot of Roman soldiers stationed in Syria were amazed at his dancing skill. And at that time, Rome had encountered imperial succession crisis. Then those Roman soldiers supported Elagabalus become Roman emperor. So after arriving in Rome to Roman Senate, Elagabalus still not well talked as standard Roman aristocrat. So he insists wearing his Syrian dancing clothes and also dance in front of Roman Senate. He also appointed other his fellow dancer and performers to other official position. Although, like going back to the notion of social imaginary, although I think our depiction of this emperor is very problematic, they are hostile to him by highlighting he is not serious. He just used his dance to kind of establish his emperorship. That's just observed. But what we can inquire about is the historiographic construction of dancing Roman soldier and cultural capital and Roman emperorship. So that's actually already a pattern that Roman soldiers stationed in Syria already have a lot of active interaction with Syrian performers. We have inscriptional evidence. So from Elagabalus, although there are much more complicated reasons why he got become Roman emperor, but dancing can be a factor behind that. But later historians highlighted it as a factor of Asian sources. So that's I would like to kind of further inquire about to learn more about the pop culture in Roman Syria and its active interaction with Roman imperialism. And as I believe K-pop will continue becoming a big thing in the US, there are definitely much more kind of fantastic scholarship on K-pop that will come up. Especially there's a book called Hegemonic Mimicry, Korean Pop Culture in 21st Century by Professor Kyung-Young Kim from UC Irvine that come out from Duke Prize in October last year. In the beginning, what fascinated me this book is the modern contemporary K-pop actually kind of arise from interaction between American soldiers stationed in South Korea in 50, 60, and the Korean entertainer. Those Korean musicians have to learn about the most up-to-date American pop music so they can properly entertain American soldiers. So what Kyung-Young Kim want to argue is that the rise of K-pop in the US doesn't come overnight, doesn't come from this year, last year, or some marketing strategy, but there's a very dynamic history about Korean-American interaction, especially American soldier in South Korea. I think that's, I cannot think of a more than perfect example about the comparison for Syrian pop performer and Roman soldier stationed in Syria. So as the K-pop continue become a big thing, so when I work on Roman Syrian pop culture and engage with those scholarship on K-pop as an Asian historian who seem to study something totally irrelevant to our time. It's also something keep me relevant. Yeah.
Thank you, Yan Xiao. This was great. I very much look forward to following your work. I feel like the future of your academic trajectory is very bright, and I hope we will meet in person in the not too distant future. Thank
I'm
you.
also looking forward to it. Thanks for your question.
You're very welcome.